That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
The British Constitution provides that taxation and representation shall go together. Therefore, women taxpayers are entitled to vote.
I have a dream today. Let freedom ring, and if America is to be a great nation, this must become true.
Hi, welcome to episode 61 of Only Human. I've got a deal for you. I want to give you a challenge. See if you can handle it. You're the mayor of a small town, one that you can create from the ground up. I'm going to give you $100 million to spend however you want to, but the town has to become self-sustainable and growing within 20 years. No tricks, nice spot of ground, underground water, good farmland, county roads. $100 million, you've got to create a self-sustainable town. Think you could do that? Would you want to? I would. I'd like to try it. Where would you start? So that example is a simulation that was created by a couple of cognitive psychologists that wanted to study how people think and the kind of mistakes that they made. So they were tasked with managing this fictional town, and they had to make decisions about things like economic growth, attracting people to live there, getting employees for any sort of businesses they wanted to begin. Of course, they had to build an infrastructure, balance all of this with the environment they found themselves in. And out of a group of educated and trained public administrators, what percentage do you think were successful? This was all a computer simulation so they could fast forward through time. Less than 30% actually pulled it off. Welcome to the logic of failure. We're going to talk today about why not only did these highly educated and experienced public administrators fail in this simulation, but some of them failed spectacularly. They caused catastrophic events, mass die-offs. It was really an interesting take, and it ended up being put in a book called The Logic of Failure. Dietrich Dörner is the author of The Logic of Failure, and he was the one that designed this experiment. A German psychologist, and he was very, very interested in exploring how individuals and organizations react to complexity, complex systems. He wanted to know why even intelligent, well-meaning people sometimes make really catastrophic mistakes. And he wanted to show, more importantly, that these errors weren't random. They followed a pattern. And that's why he called his book The Logic of Failure. If you know the patterns, you can avoid the failures. And that's what we want to talk about today. So real quick overview of the book. It explores kind of how human decision-making often falters in complex or dynamic systems. Things like environmental management or business, politics, even life itself. We're going to give a personal example or two as we go. So he did a bunch of these computer simulations, and he demonstrated how poorly thought out actions can lead to unintended, unforeseen consequences. And often they made worse the very problems they were trying to solve. And so his central message, I think, is that if we fail to understand how weak we are in the face of complexity, we can become overconfident with simplistic knee-jerk solutions. And we fail to understand the feedback and what it means in the long term. So that leads us to the Blue Thread proverb of the day. And it says, it's a quote from Dörner, "Complexity is not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be understood." Our tendency to oversimplify everything leads us to minimize our understanding of systemic reality, and often that ends tragically. For businesses, for governments, for organizations, and for individual people. So let's go back to that simulation and see what kind of mistakes people made and how they went wrong, right? Almost always they got in trouble by prioritizing short-term economic growth, right? For example, they wanted to attract people, they wanted to get self-sustaining, so they started businesses, they incentivized factories, right? And that increased jobs and it drew people in and income went up. Everything was good, but it led to overuse of natural resources like water, right? You can only pump so much water out of the ground. So in some of these cases, when they started to run out of water, what did they do? They dug more wells, they built more pipelines, they built more pumping stations. And therefore, they could keep those industries going and get water to the homes of all the people that were moving in, right? And then the shortages of water became critical because the aquifer would only provide so much, right? There were no tricks in this. All that data was available to them if they understood what they were asking from the earth to go into their make-believe town. And there were a lot of cases of environmental damage. Factories caused a lot of pollution, right? But they didn't build wastewater treatment plants, and so that harmed farmland, oversalination, public health problems, and then they didn't have the hospitals, and so all of this just kind of piled on top until they failed, right? And then the other thing was their quick fixes often backfired. You know, I gave you the example of digging more wells and more pumping stations, and those solutions really just added to the problem, right? It shortened the amount of time they had to address the problem because they didn't address the root problem, the overuse of resources. The problem wasn't we don't have enough water to run the factory. The problem was we don't have enough water to run anything for long if we continue to use it at this rate or even greater rates. As a result, a lot of these fictitious towns suffered economic collapse, right? The overstrayed system just failed. People left due to poor quality of life. Some of them even starved because they couldn't produce enough resources to keep people employed and bring food in from outside, and they'd already spoiled the farmland. So there were a lot of reasons why people, and these again educated public administrators, why they failed. Mostly they focused on the immediate problem, right? Boosting jobs, fixing a water shortage, rather than thinking about the long-term impact. And the data was there for everything that they did if they wanted to study it, but they didn't study those feedback loops. And they become overconfident that their simple solutions were just a series of small problems that they would continue to solve. And by not monitoring the key indicators that things were going south, the whole thing ended up collapsing. And when these things collapsed, in the simulations, they collapsed very quickly. And it surprised the participants. So there's some lessons here. Excuse me. I think the biggest lesson is how poorly humans are equipped to handle complex systems. Because we don't always look at or are incapable of looking at long-term effects and the interconnected nature of decisions. You know, I've used this example before, but I once worked for a chief of the Forest Service, Jack Ward Thomas, who had a famous quote that said, not only are wild ecosystems more complex than we think, they're more complex than we can think. So utter respect from a guy that spent his life studying how trees grow and streams feed into rivers and all this stuff, that said, even with all that study, I don't think I'm capable of understanding. So therefore, how do we manage something like that? So a couple of things that came out of this simulation that Dörner puts in his book as potential solutions. The first one is to think widely and holistically, right? They needed to balance, for example, economic growth with resource sustainability and quality of life issues. They needed to monitor feedback, right? When they put in a solution, they need to look holistically at how those decisions, like building factories or expanding a farm or building a library, impacted their resources. And they needed then to adjust their plans based on that near-term feedback, which they almost never looked at, right? Got the problem solved, let's move to the next problem. And both of those things led to the third suggestion that Dörner says, and he says, not only do we need to think long-term, do we need to think holistically, but we need to think into almost infinity. We've got to continue to play out the futures in every decision we make. So interesting simulation. What parallels, other than urban planning, like we just talked about, or suburban planning, might we see in our world today? Well, I think one of the big ones is environmental policy, right? I'll go back to my Forest Service days. Way back in the 1930s, right after the Forest Service was first created, there were a lot of wildland fires that were burning all over the public lands in the West. And the chief of the Forest Service put in place what he called the 30-minute rule. When a fire starts, he wants it out in 30 minutes. And so we built this massive firefighting apparatus that remains to this day. And we put out most of those dang fires, and we still do. And what did we grow? An overgrown western forest that now is unsustainable. The reason we have these mega fires is because we put out the little fires too quickly. I mean, fire is a natural part of every ecosystem, but they didn't realize that when they were protecting homes or watersheds and things like that, that they were actually damaging the long-term health of the forest. And that's something that nature is solving for us with these mega fires. But the problem with the mega fires is they burn so hot that they kill all the organic material in the soil, and things don't grow back. Small fire won't do that. Things will grow back in a year or two. Some of these big fires, you can go and see moonscapes out there from fires that burned 10, 15, even 20 years ago. So environmental policy is a big one. Corporate strategy, obviously, is a big one. Businesses that prioritize short-term things like profitability and shareholder value often fail to invest in the future, things like quality, customer service, and that leads to long-term declines. I mean, you can think of a couple big ones. Boeing, for example, General Electric, all took that model. I want quick cash now, and suffered. And they were so big and they were so powerful that how could they ever fail? Well, the same way everything fails. And as they say, the bigger you are, the harder you fall, and the longer it's going to take to reclaim, never reclaim the reputation, but maybe reclaim the capabilities. So great, we've talked about public policy and urban planning and environmental stuff and business stuff, but what about our personal life? I don't know how many times I have seen, I almost fell victim to this myself, but people that just go all in on their careers, right? They put in the overtime, they claw their way up the corporate ladder because they want to get the wealth that can build that perfect future for their family. Except by the time they get there, there's no family left, right? This leads to alienation, time away from the spouse and the children and your friends. Not only that, it can lead to poor health, long-term chronic stress-related diseases, of which there are dozens, if not scores. And the future that they were planning disappears before they can realize it. There's a great book out there called Your Money or Your Life. Can't remember the author, but that tells that story. And is it wrong to try to build a future for your family by working hard and climbing the corporate ladder? Absolutely not. But there has to be some holistic view and long-term visioning to say, at what cost am I doing this, right? Because just making the money, once again, is a very simplistic thinking in a complex system. Humans just tend to oversimplify problems. We just do it. And when we do that, when we say, man, if I could put $1.5 million in the bank, I could retire by the time I'm 50, and then we could do all of this traveling and all these wonderful things. The problem is when you get 50, you got $1.5 million, but you got to do it alone because there's nobody left with you. So make sure that we're looking at things and understanding the complexity even in our own personal lives. The second thing we're all a little bit guilty of, myself included, is a lack of humility. We think that we can take on a system. I'm a human being. I'm smart. I've got a big brain. I'm going to think my way through this, and I'm going to fix this, and I'll come out the other side bigger and badder and better, right? Recognizing the limits of your capabilities, of your knowledge, is really, really critical, especially when you're dealing with complex systems, because we fail to anticipate that in complex systems, things don't happen in a linear fashion. One small mistake can end up with a huge outcome, or one huge mistake may end up with no outcome, right? It's almost beyond our comprehension. So we need to learn that effective problem solving in complex systems requires us to take small steps and then look for any indicators that something might be off kilter, right? And that requires us to adapt, right? So the last piece of this whole adaptation and understanding the feedback and all that is when you want to try something new, if you want to try solving a problem, try a small version of it. We often say, try it off Broadway, right? Successful decision-making involves experimenting, right? I think the term they use in business is iterative. It's what SpaceX does, right? They launch, they fail something, they try to fail something, and then maybe they recognize a couple other things that failed. They quickly fix those little things. They may test it once or twice in a wind tunnel or something like that, and then they launch it again and they look for more failures. They're getting data, right? They're getting data. They want to fail fast. So they test a hypothesis. The Starship is the wonderful example right now. I'm just watching this like crazy. And, they're launching almost every 2 or 3 weeks. And you go, gosh, how fast can you build those things? And then you look at Elon's business plan. He says he wants to build 3 of them a day. And he wants to eventually be launching these things 2 or 3 a day. Right? He thinks there's enough demand out there for heavy lift to space. That's insane. How do you do that? And how do you do it fast? Well, you practice iterative thinking and rapid prototyping, right? So it doesn't all fail at once after you've already invested billions of dollars. You fail in small ways along the way. So we've kind of used the hypothetical example. Let's use a real one, right? How many of you remember the Chernobyl nuclear power plant disaster in Ukraine? If you probably remember it because it's very famous. And it's used often to highlight the lack of safety of nuclear power, which is pretty interesting since that accident didn't happen because the power plant failed, right? It failed, but it only failed because people did some things that caused it to fail. Chernobyl happened April 26, 1986, at a nuclear reactor in the Ukraine. And it exploded during a, get this, safety test. Most people think it was some kind of design failure, but the real story is way more interesting. In simple terms, this is what happened. Engineers knew that there was a possibility someday that they would lose external power to the plant, right? And it's important that they had power to the plant. Obviously, it produces a lot of power itself. Because it produced a lot of power itself, it wondered if it could draw power from its own turbines in the event of a power outage. Now, that's a legitimate question, right? So they designed a test to simulate a power outage to see how the system would perform. Therein lies the first problem, deciding to simulate with a live system. See, that's not really a simulation at all, is it? Now, just to capture this, they didn't know how the reactor was going to behave if it lost external power. This is a nuclear reactor. So they designed a simulation to lose power. They don't know what's going to happen, so they're going to simulate losing power, but they're doing it in a live nuclear reactor. So, excuse me, a little cough here today. The reactor did have some design flaws. Basically, it was unstable at low power. And there were a lot of safety devices that when it got to low power would shut the reactor down, right? They knew that it became harder to control as the power that were required to run this thing from the outside was reduced. They knew that going in. In fact, that's the reason they were testing it. But in order to conduct the simulation, of course, they had to turn off those safety systems that would result in an automatic shutdown. I know, this is crazy. This is crazy. So what did they do? They disabled critical safety systems, not only that would eventually shut the reactor down, but would provide warnings along the way. And they got deep into the data and they continued the test, even though the reactor began to behave, in their own words, strangely. Had the safety systems been up and running, it would have notified them, hey, this is getting dangerous. But this was a team of nuclear engineers, right? And they believed they understood the system. They thought they could handle it despite the unusual readings. Bottom line, they did not understand the complexity of the system. And so when it got to the point where they realized that something bad was happening, they said, well, let's just shut it down. And so when they shut it down, they removed all power, right? Instead of bringing the power back up to normal and letting their normal systems shut the reactor down or just bring it back up to full power and run normally, they removed the power, and this led to massive overheating. The reactor exploded, and huge amounts of radiation went into the atmosphere. As a matter of fact, every person on the planet has a little bit of that radiation in their bone marrow today as a result of that. Right? 2 workers died instantly. Dozens of emergency responders later died from radiation exposure and all kinds of cancer deaths and birth defects and things like that for decades and decades. And the global response to that was nuclear power plants are dangerous. And in point of fact, in my humble opinion, nuclear power is the cleanest form of energy in the world. If we truly care about the environment and climate change and all of those things, we should be embracing safe nuclear power. And even the Chernobyl reactor, built way back when, that had some design flaws, would not have failed had they not done all the workarounds to test something that led to a huge global disaster. Oddly, 3 Mile Island here in the United States, a similar type of thing. It wasn't quite as crazy, but it's a clear example of people not understanding complexity. What happened there was a minor malfunction in a valve that led to coolant loss, right? But the operators didn't realize that. They had some misleading signals. They seized on the first idea that they had, and they assumed for some reason that the reactor had too much coolant. So they reduced the flow, right? Which just worsened the situation. They didn't understand the complexity of the system. And then there wasn't a huge escape like there was at Chernobyl, but it was one that hit the news as well. Once again, damaging the reputation of something that was completely safe had they not intervened in the wrong way. So the general theme of these nuclear reactor incidents that we hear about is people don't understand them well enough, and they shouldn't screw around with them. If they are going to screw around with them, they take them offline and then mess around with them. Because a live active system, especially one as complex as a power generating plant that runs on nuclear fission, is probably not something that you ought to get overconfident about. Right? So both cases illustrate how overconfidence and incomplete understanding can lead to poor decisions and really bad outcomes. Right? There's a few other things in here that are patterns that Dörner identifies in all of his studies. And one is people get behind the information curve, right? They think they understand the system, then something comes in where they don't fully understand it, and then they try to dig for more data, and the world keeps moving forward, and they end up getting really, really behind the information curve. So anytime you start to feel that your situational awareness is beginning to degrade, that you wish you had more information, that's a key indicator that maybe there's some complexity going on that your simplistic human brain can't wrap around, right? I think probably the bottom line here is to assume things are more complex than we think they are. A simple if-then decision, whether it's in our families, whether it's as we're driving a car or feedback with workers, are often far more complex than we think, and sometimes far more complex than we can think. But if we go into every decision with a healthy respect for that we're limited humans operating in really complex systems, I think we're going to be in a lot better place to make the decisions that we need to make to keep ourselves safe, to keep ourselves growing, and to not have any of those catastrophic outcomes, to keep our town healthy after that 20-year period that we set it up. It's interesting to go full circle back to the simulation we began with, that the people that were successful did exactly that. Small changes. They were happy with small growth. They were happy with small successes. They built on successes. They didn't try to diversify everything, and there were almost never these holistic changes. They grew iteratively. I have trouble with that word, a lot like Elon's building the Starship. So key lessons from Dörner to wrap this all up. One, embrace complexity. Don't be afraid of it, but understand that simplistic approaches often fail. Learn to think holistically, interconnections, delayed impacts. Keep your eyes open, keep your head on a swivel, embrace complexity. Number two, beware of overconfidence. Sometimes our judgment and our wisdom is just limited by our human capabilities, right? Acknowledge the limits of your knowledge and your judgment. Be humble, be curious about what you don't know. And that's sometimes far more valuable when you're dealing with complex problems than acting with some sort of certainty, false bravado. Use that feedback to adapt. You tried something, it worked a little bit, didn't work as good as you could. Tweak that before you move on to something else. Monitor outcomes carefully and adjust your strategies based on whatever feedback you're getting. Rigidity is a recipe for failure. You've got to stay flexible, and when you're dealing with really complex systems, flexibility is probably not the right word. You've got to be fluid. You've got to be able to go with it. And we experiment from all these things, and we learn from all these things. And I want to finish with a quote or two from Dörner to wrap this up. We already got the first one. Complexity is not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be understood. Here's another one. Failures don't strike like a bolt from the blue. They aren't random. They result from predictable errors in thought and judgment. So at the core of it all, it's how we think, how we make decisions, and how we interact with everything that's going on around us. And the last quote I want to leave you with is this one. The hardest lesson is not how to solve problems, but how to recognize when we've misunderstood them. The hardest lesson is not how to solve problems, but how to recognize when we've misunderstood them. It's why so often I love to use the quote that says a good question is far better than a good answer, because a good question opens up many doors in our thinking. It allows us to think broadly and holistically. And a good answer, it just shuts them. So with that, let's wrap this up today. Dietrich Dörner, The Logic of Failure. Great book, pretty easy read. It's written for a layperson. Lots of cool examples, some of the ones I used today and a lot more that are in there. Dörner writes a lot. He combines psychology, systems thinking, and real-world case studies to offer really actionable insights for leaders and managers and human beings, anybody navigating complexity. So it's not just for engineers, not just for academics. It's very practical stuff. So that's book 2 of our book review series, and we'll come back next week for another one. I am not sure which one it's going to be, but I'm kind of leaning toward the book Drive by Dan Pink. I'm looking for it again. Don't have it here beside me. And we're going to come back to this issue of motivation that we've talked about before, but we're going to look at it in a completely different lens through the eyes of somebody who studied it his entire lifetime. So with that, I hope you have a happy Thanksgiving, or you had one by the time you look at this. It'll be next week. Please do all the things that you can to get better and grow where you are with the resources at hand, and we will see you soon.